Well, this is it, ladies and gentlemen. It's finally here. The first episode of the Plan 9 by 9 podcast, where we're going to take a look at the movie Plan 9 from Outer Space, 9 minutes at a time. My name is Derek, and before we kick off the show proper, I just wanted to pop in here and once again thank everybody for their support, and especially thank everybody for their incredible patience. We know we got this started a little bit later than we really intended to. You see, there were some audio issues that we had to deal with the very first episode, and ultimately, you know what? We decided that, well, if somebody like Ed Wood wouldn't let a little echoey audio hold him back, then we're not going to do that here on the show either. So in this first episode, my voice is going to be very echoey and reverb-y. Is that a word? We were recording in a new room, a new location, and I was using a new microphone, so my settings weren't 100% tops. But Scott Morris and the guests' mics are just fine. So I did what I could, much like the man we look up to, Ed Wood, and this is the show. Oh, and one more thing. We know it's pronounced Cinema Diabolica. Criswell might not. You'll see what I mean here in a second. Here we go.
Greetings, my friends. We are all interested in the Plan 9 by 9 podcast, for that is where you and I are going to spend the next hour of our lives. And remember, my friends, podcasts such as these are made possible by listeners like these. Steve Zilla 1961, The Haunted Cinema, Chris Cooling, and how could we fail to mention the Cinema Diabolica podcast? Let us punish the guilty. Let us reward the innocent. My friends, can your hearts stand the Plan 9 by 9 podcast?
For the first time, we are bringing to you the full story of what happened.
What plan will you follow now?
Plan 9. It's been absolutely impossible to work through these Earth creatures. Their soul is too controlled.
Why do I always get hooked up with these spook details? Monsters, graves, bodies. Oh, all right.
Well, it was covered up by the higher echelon.
I am a soldier of our planet. We did not come here as enemies. We came only with friendly intentions, to talk, to ask your aid for the whole universe. But your governments of Earth refused even to accept our existence.
Flying saucers, Captain, are still a rumor.
Now toddle off and fly your flying machine, darling. But if you see any more flying saucers, will you tell them to pick another house to buzz?
Minutes later, the police arrived at the scene.
Who found them?
The man and girl. The morgue wagon ought to be along most any time.
You get their statement?
Yeah, they're pretty scared.
Finding a mess like this ought to make anyone frightened.
You believe there are such things as flying saucers, Colonel?
Tell you one thing, if a little green man pops out of me, I'm shooting first and asking questions later.
You realize there's a government directive stating that there is no such thing as a flying saucer. You're a headstrong young man.
Those incidents in the graveyard these past few days just got me worried.
Don't like hearing noises, especially when there ain't supposed to be any. Yeah, sort of spooky-like.
Shall we talk now or wait?
Go ahead, my friend.
Here we are. We are finally at episode 1, or maybe we call it Plan 1 of the Plan 9 by 9 podcast. I am Derek M. Cook, one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with my other co-host,
Scott Morris, and I have been looking forward to this ever since we announced this.
Yeah, me too, man. I have been so excited about this, not just because I get to talk with you about, well, a movie that I really enjoy watching, but because we get to bring other people in as well who also enjoy the film. And this week we are joined by special guest David Heath. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Now, people know Scott from Disney, Indiana, and his many appearances on Monster Kid Radio. I'm, of course, the man behind Monster Kid Radio. But, David, you have a blog. What's it called?
Dave's Corner of the Universe.
All right, well, we'll make sure there's a link in the show notes to davescorneroftheuniverse.wordpress.com. And how often do you update?
Twice a week or so, on a good week.
I like it. I go there whenever you post something on Facebook about there being a new post. I try to go there and, you talk about the things that you learned in the month, or just kind of talking about pop culture things. And, being a Lovecraft fan, every once in a while I mention Lovecraft, and that makes makes me happy. So that's very cool, man. I'll make sure there's a link for it.
It used to be, if you typed in, is the Cthulhu mythos real into Google, I was the top, but I got knocked out by Wikipedia, and so.
Well.
A few others now.
Right on. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I mean, I could talk Lovecraft for hours on end.
And I could sit here.
And Scott can sit here and listen to us talk about Lovecraft. But instead, let's talk about something that all three of us have a lot of interest in, and that is the classic, and I do air quotes, but people can't see it on the podcast, the classic Ed Wood film, Plan 9 from Outer Space, came out in 1959. And since this is the first episode of the Plan 9 by 9 podcast, we're going to talk about the first 9 minutes. Before we do that, though, David, I wanted to ask you a question. This is actually Scott's idea. Do you want to ask?
We know that Plan 9 is reanimating Earth's dead people to take over the world. In your opinion, what do you think one of plans 1 through 8 would have been?
You know, I've actually saw several of these online, but I'm assuming that it's going to start off first with maybe reanimating squirrels, because it would be a lot easier to reanimate a squirrel, and then maybe garden gnomes. And I think Mike Nelson came up with a reanimating garden gnomes. Then maybe reanimating people from other movies. Instead of horror movies, we'll have action movies or some other type of movies. So I'm not quite sure what the rest of the plans were, but they couldn't have been as good as Plan 9, or they would have gone with them.
Or they failed. They weren't as successful. Yes.
Maybe McCarthyism was like Plan 7.
And just as a sneak preview, Derek and I will answer this question, but probably on our last episode. So stay tuned for that.
And speaking of Mike Nelson, he did a commentary track on a release of this movie that was put out, was it Blu-ray as well as DVD?
Yes, it was.
Through Legend
Films.
Legend Films, thank you. Well, that is the version of the movie that we're using for this Plan 9 breakdown, the Legend Films version, which you can get your hands on pretty easily. I believe that's the version that's on Amazon for streaming as well. Plus, I've got it up on the YouTube channel for Monster Kid Radio at youtube.com/Monster Kid Radio. And I do have it broken up into individual chunks. So if you just want to watch part 1, which we're going to talk about here, that's how you can do so. Maybe hit pause, go watch it, come back, or whatever. So it's there for you.
He also did a colorized version that I saw in the movie theater when it came out.
Yes, I did too.
The Legend Films version, I believe, is natively color. I think you have to do something to make it black and white, which I did. So, part 1, Plan 1, minutes 0 through 9. It opens with Criswell, which, you know, you open a movie with Criswell, you know you're in for a good ride, right?
Absolutely.
This has always been my favorite part of this entire movie.
Mine too.
Does it just go downhill after this?
Criswell at the top of the mountain, and then the rest of the film, and then it comes back at the end with Criswell again. But this opening speech has literally been my favorite part of this film ever since I first watched it.
And my favorite part is it keeps going from the future to the past. It's saying it's future events. This will happen in the future. And then he says, this had happened.
Yes.
Okay.
And anyone else besides Ed Wood, I would say they were like doing it on purpose and playing with our minds and trying to make it seem, is this like real or not? No, Ed Wood just thought it sounded good.
Okay.
Well, the one thing when I was listening to it again today, which it's been probably several months since I've seen this, but I watched the first 9 minutes. And I'm planning on watching each 9 minutes before each episode. But one of the things I was listening to Criswell talk, he doesn't make any specific references to the movie until the very end of his speech. So I'm thinking to myself, you know, what other movies could you stick this on in the front of that it would work? Because I just recently saw a YouTube video where they took the music from the end of The Matrix and added it to the end of other movies, and it actually worked really well.
And now some of us laugh at outer space. God help us in the future.
So I was thinking to myself, you'd have something like, the incidents, the places, my friends. We cannot keep this secret any longer. Let us punish the guilty. Let us reward the innocent. My friends, can your heart stand the shocking facts of Avengers Infinity War? Or the shocking facts about A Star is Born? But they all work.
Yes.
I've always thought it almost sounded like he was talking about a noir movie when talking about punishing the guilty.
Ooh. Oh, yeah. And I also like the fact that this has to have, when was written, was early on in the film, because he doesn't mention the correct name of the film.
No.
He actually talks about one of the original titles of the film.
Yeah, Grave Robbers from Outer Space, which, if you are to believe the Ed Wood movie that we talked about a second ago, they ended up changing the title to appease the backers, or...
That's what I had heard, that the Baptists had said that it was blasphemy.
Had they not read the script?
You know, that Criswell was a, quote, psychic, unquote.
Yeah, he had a show called The Amazing World of Criswell, and according to him, 87% of his own predictions did come true.
Including on the Jack Parr Show, he predicted that John F. Kennedy would not run for president again because of something that would happen in 1963, November, which turned out true. But have you heard some of his other prophecies?
Do you have some off the top of your head?
Yes.
Okay.
Mae West would be elected president because of her pro-space platform. Now, I didn't make this up. He was actually Mae West's psychic.
I did know that.
He also predicted that the city of Denver would be devastated by a ray from space that would turn all the metal into rubber and destroy all the amusement parks in Denver. And I can't say this with a straight face, but apparently he believed it. And that the world would end in 1999. And he had a book that had all the prophecies and you could call and check them up until the end of the world.
So are a lot of his prophecies the type like Nostradamus where you can read in multiple ways and say, yeah, Kennedy won't run for president again? Well, because he was assassinated. But, you know, the Nostradamus, there's a lot of them that you could read multiple ways to say that they're true.
I'm going to say yes, but that Denver is going to be demolished by a space ray, that's pretty darn specific.
Okay, I want to put you on the spot. Can you name one amusement park in Denver?
There is one, and I forget the name of it. Something Gardens. Gardens.
I had never heard of it. Is it rubber-based?
So throughout the course of this podcast, you may hear that flying saucer sound coming in to interrupt the conversation at hand. And that's because now, during post-production, while I'm editing the show here at Monster Kid Radio, is it a studio at this point? I want to interject something. So I'm going to use that flying saucer sound to indicate that I'm coming back on. And in this case, I wanted to come back on and say the name of the amusement park that I couldn't remember at the time. I remember now. It's called Elitch Gardens, and they're a historic amusement park in Denver. They have quite a legacy in Denver. You can look them up online. They've got a Wikipedia page and all that, and I believe they're still in operation today.
An afternoon at Elitch Gardens. What could be more fun for the kids? And mom and dad, too.
I don't remember. It's been years.
Well, since the world was destroyed in 1999...
But still, Criswell's predictions were kind of out there. And him connecting with Ed Wood, I think, is just perfect. I mean, that's Hollywood meant to be-ism. The two of them, I'm sure, got along just fine.
Well, I know a lot of times when I think of famous people in the movies, directors, actors, whatever, there's always some that I would like to meet, like I had the chance to meet. From this, Ed Wood is not the person I want to meet. I would love to have sat down and just listened to Criswell talk and just make his predictions. I think he would have been fascinating.
Sure. Now, have you seen any of the other movies that he was involved with Ed Wood?
I have seen Orgy of the Dead.
Have you ever seen an orgy of the dead? If not, let us show you a few scenes from our own Orgy of the Dead. Join the Master of the Dead and his equally infamous Princess of Darkness as they judge the beautiful Gold Girl and her sister companions. See, the Indian girl who tossed her lovers into fires and now must dance with fire. See, the bride who murdered her husband and now must dance perpetually before his skeleton. Join us. Join the Orgy of the Dead. Coming to you in flaming color and widescreen soon.
He was also in Night of the Ghouls, which is the one movie that sat in a film lab for many, many years because Ed Wood couldn't pay the lab to get the prints back, and then eventually it was released by somebody else. But he does appear in that as well, kind of sort of playing a similar part, but you don't have the Criswell Predicts set, which I love. Just the way it looks, the way it opens, the way he's talking to the camera. Like you said, it feels very film noir. You're absolutely right. So we go through this whole bit, and then we go to the opening credit sequence, which we were watching this morning, in fact, Scott and I with our respective wives, and my wife Brenda was curious about why are their names on tombstones. And we had to explain, these are the credits. But, I hadn't really thought about this. We go from tombstone slate of titles. Tombstone, slate of credits. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to who's on a tombstone and who isn't, unless either of you have any ideas.
Well, the only thing that we sort of came up with is some of the people that have tombstones actually die in the movie.
Except Bela Lugosi has a special guest appearance credit and not a tombstone.
True. But the ones that have tombstones, other than the people behind the camera, died. But then again, most of the cast dies in the movie, too.
And then Ed Wood himself has his own special credit against a Starfield, which, I mean, it's Ed Wood. Now, he does also have a credit earlier in the film because he also edited the movie, so he's listed as film editor as well, before you get to the written, produced, directed by Ed Wood screen. And after the credits, we get to my man, Bela Lugosi, at a funeral. At what may have very well been a real cemetery. Not really sure. I couldn't find any information on it. Doesn't mean I'm going to stop looking for it, but it does have this cemetery sequence, this funeral sequence with Criswell's narration. It is Criswell doing the narration, right?
Yes.
And he's giving the narration about the old man losing his wife. And every once in a while we cut to a couple of gravediggers who may or may not even have been there that same day at the same location while they were shooting that scene. And they just kind of seem bored.
Well, I was always under the impression that the scenes that we actually see Bela Lugosi in were filmed long before the rest of this movie was made, and Ed Wood just decided to use what he did and make the movie around it. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't hear Bela speak either, because he's not, I don't know how to other ways to say, but he's technically not in this movie. He's making another movie, he thinks. So that's why we don't hear him talk. That's why at the funeral at the beginning, the gravediggers were filmed separately and put in.
Well, Lugosi died in 56. This movie didn't come out until 59. And the story goes that Ed Wood did shoot some footage with him with the intent of putting it into something.
Right.
Not really sure what. And had the footage just sitting on a shelf. He didn't record sound because, well, you don't record sound and film on the same machine back then. So, yeah, we just had this stuff and we had to rely on Criswell and the graveyard's reactions to provide the story.
And I know I read too much into things, but when I saw the gravediggers, I immediately think this is Ed Wood trying to copy Shakespeare. That he's taking the Shakespeare gravediggers, not as successfully.
Huh. Ed Wood as Shakespeare. That's a phrase I don't think I would have ever said out loud, let alone thought.
I'm the only one who's ever said it.
I like it a lot because Shakespeare does have the trope, the construct where you have the characters off stage, sort of, but still they're kind of interesting. Huh. Well, we go through the funeral. We see the grave diggers pick up their shovels because they're ready to bury whatever's in the hole, and then the lights flash across the screen and we see the flying saucer, right?
And I think it's also important that Shakespeare now, Ed Wood, Criswell was saying, it's the sunset, it's the sun setting. But when the plane comes, it's the morning. It's the same incident. Yes. And I think that Ed Wood was just so in love with what he thought was his own poetry, he missed that the same thing is happening at two different times.
Well, I just figured that the gravediggers were just really slow. And they were filling in the hole all night long.
Maybe that was plan 3. Gravediggers would be slow and their bodies would build up.
So the gravediggers were played by J. Edward Reynolds and Hugh Thomas Jr., two people I know nothing about other than the fact that their name is on the Internet Movie Database as the gravediggers, in parentheses, uncredited. Don't know anything about them.
Did they do anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's find out. Hugh Thomas Jr. is listed as an uncredited soldier in the Red Badge of Courage in 1951. He's also listed as an associate producer on Plan 9, whereas J. Edward Reynolds is listed as only being involved in Plan 9 as a gravedigger and an executive producer.
Does that mean they were Baptist? That they were funding the money? That's a question mark. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something I'll look into.
Or at the very least, they kicked in a few bucks.
Right. Now, we see the flying saucer for the first time pretty early in the film.
Well, we see the plane first.
We do see the plane because we also have the plane up. Okay, let's talk about the plane. Nice bit of continuity. That it's actually an American flight. It does have American...
The stock footage of the flying plane is an American Airlines
Which
flight.
is amazing considering who we're talking about here. No disrespect, but sometimes stock footage and continuity wasn't necessarily Ed Wood's forte.
Could this be a broken clock is right 2 times a day thing?
Potentially. We actually have the American flight, and he gives the number. I wrote it down and then left the notes at home. But he does give the flight number, which I'd like to look into just to see if I can correspond it to something else. So it was American Flight 812. They don't necessarily say it was American Airlines. I think we just assumed that, but it is American Flight 812.
Burbank Tower, this is American Flight 812. Over.
I did do some digging, but I really couldn't find anything that would correspond to American Flight 812. There was a Pan Am Flight 812, but that wasn't until 1974, and the only reason that's really well known is because that plane crashed, and yeah, it was nasty. But that's a stretch. Like I said, that was in the 70s, and Plan 9 was in 1959. The Burbank Airport Tower that they keep talking to, that's actually a Bob Hope Airport, which is in the LA area, which again makes sense and kind of goes back to what David was saying regarding Ed Wood being a Los Angelino. This is where we meet our lead, Jeff Trent, played by Gregory Walcott.
The pilot of the American Airlines flight we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. He's going to become our lead in the film, or at least one of the leads. And he actually has a cameo in 94's Ed Wood.
Yes, he does.
So he does appear there. And he does have a career outside of this, including things like House 2. So good for him.
The Second Story?
Yes, The Second Story. But lots of television in his past, that sort of thing. He was an actual actor that was brought on, and he does his darndest with the material. So I'll give him that. That's all I got. That's really all I have for him. We do see the flying saucer outside the plane.
Can we talk about the set
I was trying to brush over that. No, let's talk about the set. Let's talk about the set. Oh, boy.
The first time I saw it, I thought they were pantomiming flying an airplane. I didn't even see that little control thing they had in front. I thought they were pantomiming it.
Which is what looks like just wood. Like they've cut out a circle and cut it in half.
Wood,
yes, perhaps. And they give there's one in front of the pilot and the co-pilot, but it just looks like half a steering wheel on a stick is their actual controls.
And the curtains, it's
the same curtains, basically.
It's the same curtains, though, on the space station later on.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm not surprised.
And there's some sort of protractor measuring something hanging on the wall behind the co-pilot that I have yet to identify.
I can't really identify it. It looks kind of like a dial star chart kind of thing or something. I can't really identify it too well.
I have such bad eyesight, I thought it was a clock.
That's on the wall. What's on the other side?
Clipboard hanging on the wall.
That's right. That's how we know it's official. There's a clipboard on the wall. It's a great set. It's pitch black behind the stewardess who comes in and out behind the curtain.
Well, it's because everybody in the passengers were all asleep, so she's turned the lights off on.
Again, another moment of continuity and actually putting something smart into the script. I like it. I'm dying to talk about the flying saucer, though.
Okay.
I'm dying to talk about it. What was, David, your first thought when you saw the flying saucer?
It was a metal sombrero.
Okay. And Scott, what about you?
Two pipe hands connected together with some sort of something attached to the top to make a command module type area.
And in the Legend Films release, you can actually see the string holding up the flying saucer. So there's that. The first time I saw it, I was expecting it to be a couple of pipe hands taped together. I think it looks a lot better than that. It was actually a model. It wasn't really pipe hands, despite what a lot of people thought at the time. I think it looks okay. I wouldn't mind having that. I think it looks like a decent UFO. Doesn't really move naturally, but
I would imagine that would be one of those holy grail props that probably has never survived. I've never heard of any one of them actually existing unless Forrest Ackerman has one of them.
I think Bob Burns has one.
Oh, Bob Burns had one.
I think Bob Burns has one. So there are a few out there that still exist. I don't know what model, brand, or series or number or anything was. I'd love to find out because it'd be cool to have one.
So you're saying Aurora didn't make a model of this one?
I'm betting it wasn't Aurora. It probably wasn't the people that did the Enterprise. It probably wasn't anybody like that at all. When we see the UFO and it impacts the plane and the plane shakes. I mentioned Enterprise a second ago. Yes. Very Star Trek, where everybody shakes on the set, including the control things that look like half circles. They seem very...
But the door doesn't move.
I didn't notice that.
The door stays the same.
Yeah. And you would think those curtains would shake, but they don't.
And none of the sleeping passengers wake up.
And the clipboard stays on the wall.
Yeah. Well,
this is when the UFO lands near the cemetery, and the grave robbers hear, or not the grave robbers, the grave diggers hear a weird noise.
Before we get to that, though, I would like to share my theory.
Please do.
So when I first saw this 20 years ago with my friend, I watched that scene and I said, I know that story because it's almost exactly what's called the Sperry Ufo Case, which took place in 1950, where an American Airlines, a DC-6, a UFO flew by and flashed lights inside it. Now, Sperry was a sober pilot, and so he was the rational person in the 50s. And he was in all sorts of books, interviews, movies. He was sort of we don't want to be seen as crackpots, as UFO chasers. They pointed to Sperry. And there's a lot of things that are similar. The passengers were asleep. The lights, it was an American Airlines flight. And he described it, this is the first of the cigar-shaped UFO sightings that I know of. Well, I guess you could get some in Scandinavia, and later on in the movie, they don't describe it as a flying saucer. They describe it as a cigar. And I think it's because this is what Ed Wood based this part of the movie on. And there's a 1956 movie. It's UFO. What was the full title?
I had it here a second ago. Unidentified Flying Objects, The True Story of Flying Saucers.
And it's got a narrator. It's sort of a half-acted, it had Sperry and several other witnesses. I think maybe Kenneth Arnold. But it had an actor playing a Ruppelt, which is the chief Blue Book investigator. And it has very similar pacing. Maybe all black and white 1950 movies look alike to me. But I would not be surprised if Ed Wood got the idea for Plan 9 from watching that.
Well, I know that we talked about this a little before we started recording, and it's got me wanting to try to track this down and watch this.
And I have seen this on TCM, I believe. I DVR'd it and watched it, and it's really interesting. It came out in 56, and Willis Sperry does appear in the film, has himself as like an interview subject, that sort of thing. We were talking earlier about how Harry Morgan is one of the voices, so, the general from MASH is in there. Colonel Potter?
Colonel Potter, and he was also Jack Webb's partner in Dragnet.
So he's in there, which is kind of cool. But you're right, it does have the narration style where we see a lot of footage and the narrator is driving the story, not necessarily the visuals, which is kind of Plan 9-ian. So, I wonder. Interesting, though, and something that I've said this a number of times, I'm going to go look up more information about this and see. The grave diggers. I don't like hearing noises, especially when there aren't supposed to be any noises, which is an amazing bit of dialogue.
Well, it also must be like in the Flintstones when the wail of the bird went off and Fred got off work. This weird noise must have been their end of day calling as well, because they say, well, let's get out of here, that weird noise. Like they're done for the day.
And they just drop the shovels and walk away.
No, they carry the shovels. They carry the shovels.
But they just walk away.
There is a lot of continuity issues or things that we're going to probably touch on all the way through.
So much so that I'm considering releasing part 3 before part 2 of this podcast.
I think you should. But there's one that's always really bothered me right here is the gravediggers are at the gravesite of Bela Lugosi's character's wife. Yes. They hear this noise and they start walking away. And there's a shot of them walking towards the camera. Mm-hmm. So they've had to have walked 50 feet, 100 feet away from where they were working. Then there's an insert shot of a crypt with Vampira coming around the corner. How did she get from under the ground behind all the way over there? How did the aliens dig her up and reanimate her so fast and make them, in front?
Plan 4.
Aliens can control time is confirmed.
Okay. All right. So Plan 4 from outer space involves manipulation of time.
Exactly.
Okay. I like it. That would explain a lot of the night for day or not really night for day shows.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, how does she get so far ahead of them? Because they're walking away from where she was.
In that dress.
Yes. How does she get anywhere that quickly in that dress?
True. Well, she kills the gravediggers. We don't actually see them get killed, but we do see their bodies later, and I'm willing to bet it's not the same actors.
I think they're dummies. I don't think they even look like people at that point.
Their hands are, or one of their hands is suspiciously over its face, and the other one's face down. So, who knows? This is all happening, though, while Bela Lugosi is grieving outside of his home, which we found out belonged to somebody in the cast. It's Tor Johnson's house, which is kind of cool. We're not going to give the address. But the house still stands to this day.
It's very interesting. We did find it. We went out on Google Street View, and you can find it out there. The house has obviously been repainted since the original movie, which is not surprising. But what I found fascinating is the rose bush or the flower that Bela picks up and then drops. That bush is still there. It's right next to the garage.
That's so cool.
And before I knew that, I just assumed that this sort of strange family, they should be living in something like the Addams Family. And here they're living in this, even though they're not zombies yet, they're still sort of strange. And here they are living in this typical 1950s home.
Yeah, it's an after-war tract house.
Yeah, a 1950s sitcom could take place in there.
Yeah.
But that's next door to the Beaver's house. I mean, it's that kind of home.
With a huge TV antenna.
Unfortunately, the Google Street View is not, you can't see the top of the house real well, so I can't tell if that TV antenna is still there or not.
Yeah. If we had made just a little bit more money on the Kickstarter, I'd say we should finance a road trip to go to the house. Oh, well, maybe next time.
A pilgrimage?
There we go. A pilgrimage, a Plan 9 pilgrimage.
That scares me when you say next time, because I know what movie we've been tossing around next time, and that's even a farther drive away from here.
Scott and I have spoken with a few people in confidence about what we would like to do next, but we didn't want to announce anything until we got this Plan 9 by 9 podcast completed and out there for you guys and gals to listen to and consume. I mean, you guys did support us, and we want to make sure we deliver on our promises. That said, stay tuned, because in the final episode of this podcast, Scott and I will announce what we are looking to do as our next Movies by Minute style podcast. So let the speculation begin. Back on track here, this is Bela Lugosi acting his heart out. He's distraught. He is without his wife. He is picking flowers and thinking about the flowers that were planted there by his wife. Then he walks away from his driveway and immediately gets hit by a car.
And screams.
The geographic continuity here doesn't quite work. He steps off the driveway and immediately gets hit, so that's because there's all this traffic right there. And not like down the driveway into the street, but like across the driveway, like he's going to the neighbor's yard. Okay.
Now, until watching it today, this thought had never come to me, but today it did. And for those of you that listen to Monster Kid Radio, know that right after Christmas in 2018, what movie did we see at the Joy the other night?
Oh, yeah. We went to go see Faces of Screaming Werewolf.
Right. There's a scene in there where the mummy is carrying a woman through, out the building, and all of a sudden you hear screeching tires and a death, and then the newspaper comes up that says mummy and whatever her name was killed in an auto accident. I was half expecting a newspaper to fly up.
Instead, though, we cut to stock footage of cars.
An ambulance.
Yeah, there's an emergency vehicle there, and you hear the siren. And I mean, as a podcaster and somebody who's doing sound work, I appreciate the fact that they threw in car sounds and squealing tires to communicate that they hit him with a car. But it's a little over the top, just a little bit. So is that the end of Bela Lugosi's character in this film? Well, we'll find out later in future installments of the show. But we do end up finding out that they have a very strange tradition. Apparently, the wife gets buried underground. He gets buried in an above-ground tomb.
A clown crypt.
A clown crypt, because so many people just come pouring out of it the first time we see it.
It looks like it's made out of cardboard.
Everything does. In that set looks like it's made out of cardboard.
It does. But yeah, we get the explanation, because the first time I saw this movie, I'm like, why isn't he being buried with his wife? And of course, we get the last couple to come out of the crypt, and they say it is a family tradition for him that he is buried above ground and she's not. And I like the fact that they went to that, because they knew that this was an inconsistency.
This is something I wanted to bring up. In fact, in this episode, since it's the first one in the run, I know, and we've even done it too, that we give a lot of grief to Ed Wood. That a lot of people look at Ed Wood, quote unquote, the worst filmmaker of all time, which I don't agree with. That he might have been a hack. He did things, he just did some terrible stuff. The thing is, I feel like with Plan 9, he was trying. And there are lines of dialogue put in here to justify or explain things that we're seeing on screen, like the tradition that the man is buried in a crypt and the woman's buried underground. I don't necessarily like what that implies about men's and women's roles in that family's,
But at least they addressed it.
But it's addressed, and you have the fact that Ed Wood knew or saw that the airplane was an American airline and put that into the dialogue. I really appreciate that. It was maybe a little ham-fisted. It's a little over the top, not necessarily subtle. I don't think subtlety was something Ed Wood was good at. But I think it does speak to the creative, at least in me, and I appreciate that.
Well, I've often wondered, given the restrictions that Ed Wood had, financial restrictions, access to equipment or props or whatever, he also wrote his stuff. Now, if you take a modern-day big-time director, if you take away all the money, you take away all their access to Hollywood props, you take away a team of writers that's writing the movie for them, what would they produce?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I love the Disney Ed Wood films so much is that, fictionalized or not, it really speaks to this group of friends, this camaraderie of people all brought together in the pursuit of creativity and making something. And there's the making the buck part of it too, and I get that, but I really appreciate that. And you said you wanted to meet Criswell, and I think, I would have loved to have met Ed Wood at this point in his life. I think it would have been a fascinating conversation.
I would love to have watched him. I don't know if I wanted to talk to him, but I would like to just sit back and watch him.
It would have been fun to watch him direct. I just did air quotes again.
Well, and we're so used to now in the movies that we enjoy, when the DVD or the Blu-ray comes out or the streaming, we can watch behind the scenes and watch the people work. Obviously, this doesn't exist for this film. There was no money hardly to make the movie, let alone any kind of extras or anything.
Right.
But I would love to watch a making of featurette for this film, to watch them go through the process of building the cemetery set and the choices they had to make. I think that would be fascinating.
I think Ed Wood, maybe born in a later time, would have had more success because it would have been cheaper for him to do some of the things that he was trying to do.
He would be big on YouTube.
Oh, sure. Maybe not for the reasons he wanted.
Yeah.
But I think, I certainly think so. We got really off track here in terms of what happens in the rest of this Plan 9 segment. We're pretty much towards the end of the Plan 9 bit, though, because after the funeral scene and talking about why the man is above ground and the woman's below ground,
the woman finds the gravediggers, and then we get a quick shot of Action Tor Johnson leaving the police station, but we don't know where they're going.
That's it. That's the cliffhanger.
Yes.
So I thought it was a really nice place to end that particular segment. It was not on purpose, but I loved it.
One thing I'd like to add about the cemetery, is I love the scene of the cemetery and the palm tree.
Yeah,
that is so California, and I grew up in California. Yes, there are cemeteries that have palm trees, and I think, and very much, Ed Wood was an Angelino. Very much, he was sort of a product of Los Angeles, in the same way that Stephen King is a product of Maine, and he had to be because of what he could do, but. He's very much, if you take out just the stock footage, you've got a pretty good view of 1950s, 59 Los Angeles. It's a lot of theaters, a lot of TV stations, because that's what Ed Wood liked. But it has a good, I think, sort of stock view of LA.
And that's the same for his other movies, too, not just this one. If you watch Bride of the Monster, you're going to see some scenes of L.A.
Glen or Glenda.
Yeah, especially Glen or Glenda, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And that's something that I've always said on Monster Kid Radio, too, is that one of the things I love about these movies is, we enjoy them, but we also get like a time capsule-like view at whatever was going on, either societally, with the mores and the rules or the laws were, or just what the geography was like and what it looked like back then. We're recording this in Portland, Oregon right now, and David and I are both in Oregon. Scott's visiting, but if we were to look at films that were shot in this area in the 50s or 60s, it would look totally different.
Trivia fact, Minor White, who became a famous photographer, was paid by the WPA to photograph Portland. And his pictures, Portland looked in 1930s, looked like Vienna. Now, all these buildings are all destroyed now in the 70s to make places to park cars, garages. But you look at the White photographs, and anyone who sees it says that that's what Vienna looked like in the 30s.
It's fascinating. There's also a short documentary called A Day Called X. It's about 30 minutes long. It came out in 1957, and it talks about what would happen in Portland if the bombs dropped and how Portland would handle it.
That, too, is on YouTube.
Yep. Yeah, it's very cool. It's hosted by Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford is the guy who hosts A Day Called X. And you know what? We'll put a link in the show notes because I find it fascinating. Anyway, has nothing to do with Plan 9, but you do get to see the palm trees and you do get to see some of the stuff. Most of Plan 9 does take place in various sets. So a lot of it's constructed. And you do deal with the cemetery set, which looks nothing like the graveyard that we saw earlier in the film. And this is something that Scott and I were talking about when we watched the clip this morning. Do you think that was a real cemetery they shot at the very beginning with Bela?
I don't know. The one I see, and I can't remember where I see it, but you see the palm tree, and I'm not sure where I see it. I think that's a real one.
Okay.
I don't know about that, and obviously I don't think
where the crypt is.
But there's, and I can't remember where I saw the palm tree sticking out with the.
I believe the palm trees are when we see the gravediggers.
Okay. I think that is real, but I don't know about
the stone looks like a real tombstone, but then there are some real kind of janky looking wooden crosses propped up all over the place too.
I would love to think it was guerrilla filmmaking, that they just ran onto this, but I'm not sure the Baptist church that funded it would have let them do it. Or maybe the Baptist church had its own cemetery.
Or, that was shot with Bela before, so maybe
that's
it was
true.
even shot before.
That's right, so it would have been before then.
We also talked about maybe it was a abandoned cemetery. Not that the corpses abandoned it, but
I'm tired of being here. Let's go somewhere else.
But a non-operating cemetery anymore that Ed Wood knew about, or a friend of his said, hey, you can go film there. There's not going to be anybody there.
Plus, he's in, the movie-making capital of the world. It could have been a set somewhere. It could have been something set up for something else that he had access to or found access to.
Maybe he saw it when he stole the octopus
for Bride of the Monster.
It's like, oh, there's a cool set right over here. I
think the movie with Criswell has a certain weight. If you take the Criswell narration out of it, it doesn't feel as, I'm going to say even as good. I think Criswell's narration really sells a lot of it, and I like having his voiceover, and I love that you called it noir-ish, because that really does have that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I get hate mail, but I like Blade Runner with the voiceover more than the other versions of Blade Runner. And I do. I think that you're right. It does. It makes it noir-ish. It ties it together where Wood couldn't do it by his filming. And Criswell's a hoot and a half.
Yes. His cadence is just so much fun to listen to.
Oh, yeah.
But now I want to hear Criswell narrate Blade Runner.
I'll see if I can get Josh Kennedy to do that for us. Josh is the filmmaker, friend of ours, but he's also the person who did the Criswell-like voiceover for our pitch video, which, again, Josh Kennedy, big shout out to you, man. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
One last thing, with Criswell, too, and Vampira, those were L.A. celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
They were very much on the L.A. So that's another tying in to Los Angeles. He had sort of this niche celebrity there.
Now, this is either during or after Vampira started as a horror host. That's kind of where she really became known, is through that. Was she hosting at the time of the production of the film? Do we know? Do we know what her career looked like?
I assumed, but I may be wrong. I assume that she was just doing the local LA, maybe before she changed LA stations.
So I don't know if this makes us all bad monster kids or not, but we were having a hard time remembering all the exact dates regarding Vampira's career as a horror host. It was the mid-50s, so 1954 is when she premiered, actually, May 1st, 1954. So when Plan 9 was being done, she already had a name for herself as Vampira. She did her own show. She appeared on a few other things as well, like the Red Skelton Show. She appeared in Life magazine, all of that. leading up to wherever she was when Ed Wood cast her for Plan 9 from Outer Space. And I think this will be the last time I interrupt the show.
One thing I've always wondered, I didn't grow up in L.A. At that time frame. If it wasn't for this film, I would have had no idea who Vampira was.
Well, back then, too, horror hosts were so local and so regional. And the Vampira show actually only ran through 55. So the TV show would have ended, but the cult of celebrity around her still would have been going.
So I knew who she was, and I knew who Bela Lugosi was before I saw this movie.
Oh, sure.
Because it was still there in the 50s. I think that I even remember them running reruns of her show in the LA market.
But for people not in that market, growing up in that market, if it wasn't for this movie, we wouldn't know who she was.
Right. So, I mean, it's cool to see her there, too. I mean, she did a couple of other small bits here and there, but, I mean, this is really her only big film claim to fame outside of the celebrity stuff and the TV stuff. Mela Nurmi was her real name, and she was
Finnish.
She
was from Finland.
Finland, yep. Mm-hmm. Finnish American actress. From what I understand, an incredibly nice person. I'm friends with somebody who used to spend a lot of time with her in her later years and drove him around town in his hearse, and she had a great time. But, I mean, she's great and looks like she belongs in a horror movie, even though she doesn't really say much.
Does she say anything?
I think that was part of the deal, according to the Ed Wood film, that she'd appear in the movie as long as she didn't have to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And Bela doesn't talk at all, but of course it's always a treat to see Bela. And as much as I'm against colorizing black and white films, I have seen Plan 9 Rift showing through Fathom Events or whatever. Yep. And I went there specifically because I knew they had colorized the film, and I wanted to see Bela in color. He's available in color in a movie called Scared to Death, but the prints and transfers of that are so washed out. To see him on the big screen in color, decent transfer, was a treat.
Every time I watch the film, I'm always sad with the meta-knowledge that he passes away during the production of this film.
Mm.
But it's great to see him, because I don't know how much of the Ed Wood film is true and how much has been embellished with the struggles that he went through with drugs and everything. But the fact that if he had even half of the struggles that we see in that movie, he is acting the best he can act. And it's really, really powerful, the scene with him in front of Tor's house. He sells grief to me really well. He still had the talent.
He still had it, man. Still had it. Well, we are nearing the end of the first episode of Plan 9 by 9, ending Plan 1. Before we wrap up, is there anything else either one of you have about the first 9 minutes of the film?
I think we covered it.
Yeah, the only problem is I had a hard time stopping at 9. I wanted to keep watching more of it.
Well, you and I get to. Well, and you can too, David. I'm not saying you can, but we'll save that for the next recording with the next person coming up, which we haven't decided yet. Okay, I lied. This is the last time I'm interrupting the show, and that's to let you know that we do know who's going to be in the second episode, and that is the horror host, Lord Bloodraw. And now this is the last time I'm interrupting the show. At least for this episode. David, again, it's the website.
Dave's Corner of the Universe.
And I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes to that. David has been a great supporter of Monster Kid Radio over the years. It's always awesome to talk monster movies with him and Lovecraft with him. And it was awesome to talk about Plan 9 with you, sir.
I've really enjoyed it. So thank you, both of you.
Well, one thing I want to say before we sign off, I want to thank Dave. I also want to thank all the rest of the backers for allowing us to talk about Plan 9. It is amazing that so many of you reached out to help us with this venture. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I just am floored by the response that we got with this.
Pretty amazing. I'm going to say thank you as well. I love that Scott said that we are now allowed to talk about the movie, as if we weren't going to be able to talk about the movie at all if the Kickstarter didn't work out. But no, we are only doing this because we have the support of people like Dave and everybody else. So thank you to everybody.